first American Mallet was the brainchild of Baltimore and Ohio President Leonore F. Laurie. Laurie was actually a product of the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he served in a variety of engineering roles for 24 years. While working in Mexico from 1881 to 1883, he became familiar with Robert Fairley's articulated bogie locomotives. Convinced of the Fairley's potential, he urged his superiors at the Pennsylvania Railroad to adopt the concept, but to no avail. Laurie also became familiar with the work of Anatole Mallet, specifically the compound articulated, and was convinced an Americanized version would be ideal to meet the need to haul heavy freight over mountain grades. This was a particular issue on the Baltimore and Ohio. Since the road was built to mid-19th century standards, lines crossing the Alleghenies could be best described as crooked and steep. After being installed as president of the Baltimore and Ohio in 1901, Laurie found himself not only with the agency, but also the wherewithal to make an American compound articulated a reality. The idea was under consideration as early as 1902, but with the St. Louis Exposition coming up in 1904, Laurie got the ball rolling in earnest in late 1903. A collaboration between Baltimore and Ohio Chief Mechanical Engineer James Mulfield and Alco's Carl Mellon made Laurie's vision a reality. Mulfield and Mellon's design included two six-coupled engines with 56-inch drivers, resulting in a 0660 wheel configuration. Both engines featured Walschaerts valve gear. However, the rear engine was equipped with a 10-inch diameter piston valve, while the front engine utilized slide valves. The locomotive was nearly 80 feet long and weighed 167 tons, which made it rather large and heavy for the time period. But the large firebox with 72 square feet of grate area provided heat to a boiler operating at 235 psi. All of this taken together gave the six-coupled compound a top speed of 21 miles per hour and rated at 2,000 horsepower. Tractive effort was impressive at 65,600 pounds, but the tractive effort story doesn't end there. Alco equipped the locomotive with what was termed a start valve. When the valve was open, high-pressure steam could be admitted to the low-pressure cylinders, boosting starting tractive effort to 78,800 pounds. The Alco-B&O collaboration resulted in the largest steam locomotive built to date. The job of building this monster was given to Alco Schenectady in 1903, and the locomotive was completed in early spring of 1904, just in time for the St. Louis Exposition in July of that year. The Baltimore and Ohio's big new toy was given the road number 2400 and was the sole member of the road's O class. In 1915, the road number was changed to 7000 and given the class designation DD1, of which it was also the only member. While the Baltimore and Ohio would go on to roster a variety of articulated power, number 2400 was the only full adhesion six-coupled compound the B&O would ever own. But nonetheless, it was groundbreaking in more ways than one. Prior to 1904, American locomotives employing Walschaerts valve gear were few and far between, with William Mason's bogie engines being the most notable exception. After number 2400 established itself as a success, Walschaerts valve gear saw much wider acceptance and would be widely used throughout the balance of the steam era. With the St. Louis Exposition coming up fast and the deadline for submitting exhibits set for April 30th, the Baltimore and Ohio didn't have time to extensively test what was the largest steam locomotive in the world. But they did manage to squeeze in a test run on a New York Central line near Schenectady, New York. A 3.5-mile stretch with reverse curves and an 0.8% grade was chosen. Number 2400 was coupled to the end of an 83-car train with an estimated weight of 3,600 tons. On the head end was a New York Central consolidation. The day of the test saw rain move through the area, so the rails were wet just to make things a little more interesting. According to Baltimore and Ohio and Alco personnel present at the time, the test run went off without a hitch. An Alco brochure published a year later claims that 75% of the work to move the train was done by the compound articulated, while the consolidation was only doing 25%. After this brief test run, the locomotive was readied for shipment to St. Louis. In recognition of the St. Louis Exposition being the largest such fair to date, number 2400 was named after the host city. The name St. Louis was applied to both sides of the forward sand dome and under the cab windows. The St. Louis was shipped cold, or dead in train, over the New York Central to Monroeville, Ohio. From there, she was transferred to the Baltimore and Ohio's Newark Division and on to St. Louis. While on display in St. Louis, number 2400 drew quite a bit of attention, since no one on this side of the Atlantic had ever seen such a thing. Its sheer size and unusual wheel configuration left many scratching their heads, and looking as if someone tried to cram two engines under one boiler, which was the whole point of this exercise, was lost on most observers. Critics of the design claimed the locomotive was unproven too big, too heavy, and too complex. Since many locomotives of novel design had already come and gone, skeptics were quick to question its practicality. Ever since number 2400, or St. Louis, rolled out of Alco's Schenectady works, there had been a lingering question of why now and why the Baltimore and Ohio? The compound articulated had been around since the mid 1880s, but it took nearly 20 years for an American railroad to embrace the concept. Some believe the St. Louis Exposition in 1904 was the driving force behind Lurie's decision to build the locomotive, but there were other things going on the Baltimore and Ohio that were factors as well. Since becoming president, Lurie was overseeing a major rebuilding and regrading project on the Baltimore and Ohio that was costing tens of millions of dollars. Perhaps he saw the compound articulated as a more economical way with dealing with the sharp curves and steep grades. And while the exposition may have helped justify its construction, the locomotive may have been meant to deliver a message. The Baltimore and Ohio had just come out of receivership only 5 years earlier. Showing up at St. Louis with the world's largest steam locomotive told the industry and the world at large that the Baltimore and Ohio was back and in a big way. After the St. Louis Exposition, the locomotive was placed in service on the Baltimore and Ohio, where it earned the nickname Old Maud after a popular cartoon mule of the same name. Old Maud silenced its skeptics after a successful performance on one of Baltimore and Ohio's most difficult lines, the Sandpatch grade. Sandpatch is where the Baltimore and Ohio's Connellsville division crests the summit of the Alleghanies near Myersdale, Pennsylvania. Westbound movements over Sandpatch had to contend with a 1.5% ruling grade, while eastbound movements had it a little easier with a 1% ruling grade. All told, the Sandpatch grade spans 100 miles between Cumberland, Maryland and Connellsville, Pennsylvania, and crests the Alleghanies at an elevation of 2,273 feet. At the top of the grade is Sandpatch Tunnel. At 4,777 feet long and a 1% grade inside the tunnel, it just added to the difficulties faced by eastbound movements. The Baltimore and Ohio would routinely assign helpers to particularly heavy trains moving east or west. On eastbound movements, one helper would cut off ahead of the tunnel while the other would continue pushing through the tunnel. On trains moving west, both helpers would cut off. While Sandpatch wasn't the worst grade on the Baltimore and Ohio, Mulfeld had his reasons for choosing it for Old Maud's debut. Since Sandpatch was a very busy single-track line, with the majority of loads going eastbound, Mulfeld wanted to increase the capacity of eastbound traffic while also reducing the number of helper crews required on the division. This is specifically what Old Maud was designed for in the first place, and with the locomotive's brief but successful trial on the New York Central the previous year, things were looking promising. On February 17, 1905, Old Maud was made ready to tackle the Sandpatch grade. The day brought with it 20-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, 10 inches of fresh snow, and high winds, so conditions were less than ideal. Old Maud was coupled to the rear of a 40-car train weighing 1,850 tons, with a 160-ton consolidation working the head end. With the articulated working in compound mode, the train departed the Rockwood Yard moving east up Sandpatch Grade. Rockwood was about 16.5 miles west of the summit and 460 feet lower in elevation. For the first 9 miles, the trip was uneventful, but some new and unexpected challenges lay ahead. 7 miles west of the summit, a freight train moving in the same direction on the same track had stalled on the 1% grade on Sandpatch Tunnel's western approach. The train was comprised of 15 cars weighing 650 tons, with a 120-ton consolidation on the head end. There were reasons aplenty to keep things moving, so Old Maud's train coupled onto the stalled freight, and all three locomotives went back to work climbing Sandpatch. Shortly after getting underway, both consolidations began having trouble maintaining steam pressure. The bitter cold and coal contaminated with snow was the culprit. Meanwhile, Old Maud was burning soft, run-of-the-mine coal that was also contaminated with snow, but a single fireman was able to maintain boiler pressure between 235 psi and blowing off. For the rest of the trip up Sandpatch, Old Maud was almost single-handedly pushing a 2,500-ton train and two nearly winded consolidations weighing an additional 280 tons. The two 7-degree reverse curves on the 1% grade required Old Maud to be simpled twice, but she kept the train moving for some distance even after both consolidations had closed their throttles. The train finally came to a halt when the engineer in the lead locomotive applied the brakes, causing Old Maud to stall while operating in simple mode. While all of this tonnage was probably moving at a crawl, this was a very impressive performance regardless of the speeds being attained. After this encouraging run, Old Maud went to work full-time on Sandpatch, and while she was designed for helper service, Old Maud would also log nearly 1,800 miles as a road engine as well. The locomotive saw service on both sides of Sandpatch, but the majority of the time was on the western grade, working as a road engine from Connellsville to Rockwood and a helper from Rockwood to Sandpatch. For the balance of 1905 and into 1906, the Baltimore and Ohio continued to evaluate number 2400 like the experimental locomotive she was. The operational experience gained during this time led to the Baltimore and Ohio to some interesting conclusions. The first was Old Maud eliminated the need for double-heading consolidations on westbound runs out of Connellsville. With Maud pushing, only one consolidation was needed, and the tonnage could be increased by nearly 50%. 2,025 tons for the two consolidations, 3,210 tons for Maud and one consolidation. When operating as a road engine out of Connellsville, Maud could handle the same tonnage as two consolidations, 2,370 tons, and make the same time over the road to Rockwood. But coal consumption was reduced by 33% and water consumption by 25%. While it would seem Maud was earning her keep on the Baltimore and Ohio, there were some things that were reading down to her detriment. The first was speed. On the run out of Connellsville as a road engine handling 2,370 tons, Maud was making about 10 miles per hour, the same as the double-headed consolidations handling the same tonnage. The other were repair costs. While working as a helper, Maud made the same mileage between major repairs as the consolidations, but when working as a road engine, the short wheelbase of the engines and the lack of a pilot truck caused rough riding qualities that accelerated the wear and tear on the locomotive. This explains why the Baltimore and Ohio used Maud predominantly as a helper stationed out of Rockwood. The Baltimore and Ohio's next move in the motive power department was perhaps a little unexpected, but also understandable. In April 1905, the road placed orders for 250 new locomotives valued at $4 million. Oddly enough, there wasn't a single articulated among them. Some have interpreted this as an indication of the Baltimore and Ohio being dissatisfied with number 2400. However, comments made by Mulfeld at the New York Railroad Club in 1906 run contrary to this assumption. Mulfeld admitted that there was definitely room for improvement, but he described the locomotive as efficient and economical since it was doing the same work as two consolidations. The Baltimore and Ohio wouldn't take delivery of another articulated locomotive until 1911. With 1905 and 1906 being, more or less, an evaluation period for Old Maud, the railroad hadn't achieved the level of confidence necessary to invest heavily in the type. The panic of 1907 and the brief depression that followed hit the Baltimore and Ohio hard. The same can be said for other mineral hauling roads as well as the locomotive builders. Alco and Baldwin saw orders drop by 68%. Even the Pennsylvania Railroad didn't purchase any new motive power between 1907 and 1909. Business conditions began to improve in 1908 and into 1909, but the Baltimore and Ohio was using the cash it did have on infrastructure improvements. It wasn't until 1910 that B&O felt confident enough in both articulated power and the economy to begin investing in new motive power. That year, the Baltimore and Ohio placed its first order for 10 8-coupled full adhesion compound articulateds. These were the first of the LL1 class, which would number 30 by 1913. Also in 1911, the Baltimore and Ohio took a chance with a 2680 Baldwin kit Mallet, which was a converted E24 class consolidation. And while the kit Mallet wasn't successful, the Baltimore and Ohio had planted its flag in articulated power. As for Old Maud, her performance on the Sandpatch grade was drawing so much attention that it catapulted the locomotive to celebrity status. Not only was the Baltimore and Ohio benefiting from the increased tonnage being moved over Sandpatch, but Maud turned out to be a public relations bonanza as well. Numerous newspaper articles featuring the big locomotive were published in the years following Maud's arrival on the Baltimore and Ohio. Even the New York Times featured the locomotive on page 2 of their June 11, 1905 issue. Railroad executives from just about every railroad operating in mountainous territory, including the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Union Pacific, made the pilgrimage to Connellsville to see number 2400 in action. But Old Maud's reign as the world's largest steam locomotive was short-lived. In October 1906, the Great Northern's Baldwin-built 2662s snatched the title from Old Maud. The year 1908 saw number 2400 transferred to the Cumberland Division to work the eastern grade of Sandpatch. This transfer proved to be short-lived, since Old Maud's absence on the western grade was felt almost immediately, resulting in a transfer back to the Connellsville Division. In 1916, two 880 compounds began to arrive from Baldwin and Alco. Their presence resulted in Old Maud being transferred to the Chicago division and put to work in hump service at the Willard Yard. Even though plans had been drawn up to simple Old Maud, they were never implemented, and it's doubtful whether it would have changed the Baltimore and Ohio's plans. The locomotive would serve at Willard until 1927. In 1937, Old Maud would make her last public appearance. The locomotive was cleaned up and placed on display for the bicentennial celebration for the city of Kaiser, West Virginia. The following year was the end of the line for Old Maud. She was cut up for scrap in January 1938.